Tonight on Nation to Nation, a victim of the system, Marlene Carter suffers behind a decade of incarceration.
Many of us believe that she would be far better, obviously, in the community, involved in healing ceremonies and approaches with her family.
Columnist Doug Cuthan talks about the Western separatism movement. Not with our land, he says.
Treaties were made between our people and the Crown, not some band of right-wing people who want to take us out of Confederation.
And we catch up with Ontario's former child advocate. Irwin Elman's office was closed by the Doug Ford government.
Our government today is worshiping at the altar of the deficit and worrying about that more than worrying about our children right now.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamoran and welcome to Nation. Marlene Carter is a Cree woman from the Onion Lake First Nation in Saskatchewan, and she's been incarcerated in jail or a psychiatric hospital since 2009. A lot of that time has been spent in restraints, months at a time. A lifetime before that of sexual and physical assault. This is how she looked as a younger woman and a mother of three as compared to how she looked in 2016. It's quite a difference. A suicide attempt restricted oxygen to her brain in 1999, and Ms. Carter now bangs her head against hard surfaces when stressed. She's also been convicted for assaulting jail staff. APTN News has followed her case closely since 2016, when Carter told us she lashes out because of the restraints. Senator Kim Pate also knows Ms. Carter well, for 20 years now. To help explain her situation and more, we are joined by Senator Pate. Welcome to Nation.
Thank you.
3 years ago, when you were executive director of the Elizabeth Fry Society, you told APTN News that you would bet your life on Carter's eventual return to her community. I mean, what's happened?
Yeah. Well, at that time, the community was very keen to look at what's called a Section 84 or a Section 81 release under the Corrections and Conditional Release Act. That was, for all kinds of reasons, the community was dissuaded from trying to engage in that kind of release. It involves a contract between the community or a group of people in the community and the government, particularly the Minister of Public Safety. And my view is that it was stalled until the point where she was no longer a prisoner. She now is subject to mental health legislation. She's still in a federal penitentiary, but the Regional Psychiatric Centre is duly designated a federal penitentiary and a psychiatric hospital. And in Saskatchewan, one of the horrible realities is that the mental health system believes that the best mental health services are provided for many people in the Regional Psychiatric Centre, particularly if they've already been criminalized. Many of us have very different views of that. I've watched individuals go from federal prison cells to mental health facilities, and within less than 24 hours usually do immeasurably better. So many of us believe that she would be far better, obviously, in the community, involved in healing ceremonies and approaches with her family. And with her, even members of her community who care about her. As a stopgap measure, going to the Battleford Hospital and getting closer to home would be a step, but my understanding is the mental health system is not willing to entertain that, so she languishes in the Regional Psychiatric Centre.
But is there something in her home community of Onion Lake or the federal government could do better, I suppose, to help her succeed on the outside?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the difficulties is there was interruption with that, and so now it would require, because it could have been possible under the corrections legislation when she was still a prisoner. She is no longer a prisoner. Her warrant expiry, so her sentence is completely expired. Now she's subject to the mental health legislation. It would require basically resourcing through health services. Right now, the provinces are paying the federal prison system to keep her in the penitentiary. And we know from what the parliamentary budget officer costed those figures at, that it would be far less expensive and in human ways, in social ways, for Marlene in personal ways, and for the entire system, for taxpayers, if in fact resources were developed in the community, even if it was around-the-clock support services for her, her being involved in getting her own home going, some kind of supported independent living with healing supports would be far less expensive and far more effective for her in the long term if it was in the community.
So she's now kind of provincial responsibility now. Is she kind of slipping through a jurisdictional crack now?
Well, I think nobody is wanting to take responsibility for making a decision to move her into the community. And yet, when she has opportunities, she was going out on passes for a while into the community. When she has opportunities, she does well. In a prison setting, or even in a psychiatric hospital like the Regional Psychiatric Center, which is duly designated a prison and a hospital, always security trumps therapy. And so we need to be looking at the sorts of approaches that could be used to benefit her in the community. Some people have raised that when she was at the psychiatric hospital in Brockville, she was charged with, even though she was deemed incompetent, there were attempts to charge her with assaulting a nurse. The whole investigation of that showed that, in fact, where she was placed in with men, put in precarious situations, not having, full support in terms of the types of healing that she would have responded to more positively, that those efforts have never really been tried with Marlene, and anybody who knows her well, particularly her family, wants to see those sorts of attempts.
I guess at this point, do you want to make any new bets on when you think she might get out?
No, I mean, I certainly want to see her out in the community. I thought there was such a good chance of her getting out last time. Clearly I was wrong, and we'll keep working on trying to get her there.
Before I let you go, Senator Pate, I do want to get your thoughts on the new Senate groups that have popped up in the Senate. The Progressive Senate group, which was just announced today, and the Canadian Senators group. How do you foresee them affecting the way the Senate works now?
It's hard to know. I think an independent Senate is just that, and I'm hoping, certainly one of the things we saw just near the end of Parliament on Bill C-83, the segregation bill, was that even though many people recognize that it was really a litigation strategy to aim to look like the government is doing something as they're heading to the Supreme Court of Canada on the issue of solitary confinement, in the end, the government decision to reject the Senate amendments was not overturned. There was a significant number of us who voted against the government message. I think when we see a situation where we will stand up independently because something is the right thing to do for all Canadians, particularly those who are minorities, I think that's a good thing. So I'm not certain what these new groups will mean, but hopefully it means that we're actually doing our job as representing minority interests, sober second thought, and not just rubber stamping legislation that comes through.
Of course, there is a report that the Progressive Senate group wants to poach independent senators to join their group. Are we just moving back to partisanship again?
I have no idea what all those strategies mean, but I do know that there are a number of us who are very interested in making sure that the Senate remains an independent, not a partisan body. So I can only speak for myself on that, and those of us in the independent senators group still are committed to that and to looking at ways to have the Senate not operate in a partisan because many of the criticisms about the Senate are that when it operates in a partisan manner, it actually just replicates what's happening in the House of Commons, and our job is to actually take what comes from the House of Commons, not interfere with what parties are, when the party in power is elected on a certain platform, but where it isn't a platform issue and where it is an issue that, in fact, we should be looking at the implications for all Canadians, to do that in an independent, non-partisan, sober second thought manner.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out, and hopefully Ms. Carter's situation can also have a happier ending as well.
Absolutely.
I want to thank you again for speaking to me. Thank you.
No, thank you very much.
After the break, columnist Doug Cuthand joins me to talk about Wexit. Welcome back. As we just heard, Justin Trudeau may still have the support he needs in the Senate. But what about out in the West? The Liberals failed to capture a single seat in Alberta or Saskatchewan, and there's been a lot of talk about those two provinces wanting to separate. Here to speak about all that is Doug Cuthand. He's a columnist with the Saskatoon Star-Phoenix and recently wrote a column about Western separatism, or Wexit. Mr. Cuthand, thank you for coming on Nation to Nation.
Oh, you're welcome.
Now, in your column you said the West separating, or Wexit, is kind of laughable. Why is that?
Well, it just comes right after the election, and it's so artificial. It just seems to, there really wasn't much of a groundswell out here to begin with, and then there's a groundswell now, I guess, mainly in Alberta. But as far as Indian country goes, it hasn't made a ripple. There's no real desire to leave Canada on our part at all. We have treaties, and that's where with Canada, and that's sort of where we're staying.
So does Trudeau or the Liberal Party really need to take any of this seriously? I mean, I'm old enough to remember the Western Canada concept when that was the Western Separatist Party back in the 80s, and they actually elected an MLA. Are we anywhere near that?
Well, I think we should take it seriously, because I think there's a lot of misinformation rolling around out there, and if there isn't some action taken against it, this thing is going to gain some traction, and that could be dangerous. And you're right, we could get a few MLAs, we could get a more active party, separation party going, something like that. But really, if you stop and take a sober second thought look at this whole thing, Alberta needs Canada now more than ever, because they're in a state of economic upheaval. We're going to witness the end of the oil boom out here. We're going to go back to basically pre-Leduc times, when we have an agricultural economy, and it's not going to be quite that bad, but it's still a very major upheaval for the economy out here, and the government has got to quit fooling around and take it seriously, and stop trying to bring back the oil economy that's fading fast.
And you talked about this isn't making a ripple in First Nations. Of course, nobody's talking about they really wanted to separate. There are legal responsibilities. There are treaties, for example, that would have to be taken care of.
Well, absolutely. We have treaties 7, 6, and 4, and 8, and running across these, and Treaty 10 across the two prairie provinces here. And these treaties were made between our people and the Crown. Not some band of right-wing people who want to take us out of Confederation. So they'd have to renegotiate this. They'd have to somehow say, look, this doesn't apply anymore. If you're going to leave, are you going to be have the Queen as head of state, for example? If you don't, well then the treaties we made with the Crown have to be renegotiated.
I guess they would be with Premier Moe. Earlier this week, he was out here in Ottawa to meet the Prime Minister, and he left the meeting disappointed, as he said in his press conference. How is this meeting playing back in Saskatchewan?
Well, I noticed some of the commentary coming out of the newspapers now. There's sort of the bloom is off the rose on Moe. He's just in his first year as Premier, and so he's had this kind of rookie romance going with him. But on the other hand, people are saying, well, for heaven's sakes, let's govern the province. Quit fighting the election and quit acting like an opposition. It's sort of like they're sour grapes because the Conservatives lost. So there is a bit of a pushback now, and people are saying that we've got to get on with this, and something positive has got to come out of this. We just can't keep acting like an opposition party, but rather get cooperative here and start working with the federal government.
In that same press conference, he didn't say the S word. He didn't mention separatism himself, but he talked about Saskatchewan having more autonomy, but he wasn't clear about what more autonomy means. I just don't know if you can shed some light on that.
I really don't know what he means by autonomy. I know that in Alberta they're looking at separating the police force, for example, or the Canada Pension Plan, other things like this, in which they'll have more autonomy, but it's like Saskatchewan's got 1 million people, and you can't compete with the Canada Pension Plan with 36 million people. I mean, why would you want to change it? For example, a lot of people have got their money invested in that, and you'd reinvent the wheel, but for 1 million people, it really doesn't make sense. And so when they talk about their autonomy and that, I think they're really using the Western separatism movement as a bit of a catalyst. They're kind of backing up against it and say, if you don't meet our demands, this is what's going to happen. And so they really Moe especially, hasn't come out and condemned the separatist movement. And that's people are waiting for an answer here.
Of course, there has been talk that Trudeau in his cabinet still needs some sort of representation. But of course, one of his oldest cabinet ministers out west, Ralph Goodall, went down to defeat. How is he going to accomplish that if there's no MPs out there?
Well, he might have to do what Trudeau Sr. did, I believe it was, with Hazen Argue, who was a Saskatchewan senator brought in as Minister of Agriculture. He might have to do something like that to, to get some representation. In the north here, we had two very strong Aboriginal women running, and the bad thing was they split the vote, and a Conservative came in. Otherwise, there would have been either an NDP or a Liberal member for the northern Saskatchewan. So, it's not as if it was a clean sweep. There's about a 30% vote in this province that wasn't Conservative. And the same thing holds for Alberta.
Speaking of conservatism in Saskatchewan, I mean, how do First Nations fit into that kind of conservative base there in the prairies?
That's kind of interesting because at one time when we had John Diefenbaker here as a Prime Minister, people of my father's generation were were conservatives. They liked him. I liked John Diefenbaker. But what killed it really was the Reform Party and their open hostility toward First Nations. They went out of their way to show bad management and corruption and just, really humiliating our people. But it was good for their base, and it coalesced their base around them. And that type of attitude stuck with the Conservative Party through Harper and now Scheer, that there is a strong anti-Indigenous element in that party, and our people know it. And there's very little support. The old red Tories, or the Conservatives, you want to call them, that supported Diefenbaker, that element is dwindling away. So there's not that much support out here for the Conservatives.
Finally, I have to ask, in your column you compared the premiers, Moe and Kenny, to Spike and Chester from a Warner Brothers cartoon. Are you ready to say who is Chester and who is Spike?
Well, Kenny's obviously Spike. He's a tough little guy walking around saying, "Come on, I'll take you all on." And Moe, with his small government and everything else, is sort of hopping along beside him saying, "Yeah, me too." So I just I thought that was an interesting comparison, so I just put it in there.
Well, at least we got the exclusive answer right here. Mr. Cuthand, thank you for speaking to me.
Oh, you're very welcome.
We'll have more after a short break. Welcome back. We continue to follow the crisis in child welfare because Indigenous children keep dying. No one knows this better than Ontario's former child advocate, Irwin Allman. He's in Ottawa to give a speech, and Nation to Nation producer Kenneth Jackson is with him now at the Chateau Laurier. Kenneth.
Thanks, Todd. Irwin, it's good to see you.
Nice to see you too.
We continue to follow child welfare in Ontario. We know Doug Ford's government is traveling around trying to understand the system. What do you think of his efforts so far?
Well, I think the government originally aggressively took a stance about child welfare and took millions and millions of dollars out of their budget, and then as part of what I would say their passive-aggressive approach to reviewing what they've done over the last almost 2 years, they've decided, well, before they take money out, they might as well listen. I think my worry is, and my belief is, that they've crossed the threshold of believability, that they'll do what they're going to do, and it's going to be up to service providers, the community, corporations to just do the best we can while this government is in place, because at every turn, cuts to services that support children and families are going to happen.
There's no sense of urgency. We've reported on, children are dying. You were quoted in our story, every 3 days a child is dying connected to care.
Yes.
Why is there not a sense of urgency? Like we put it out there, like you've put it out there. It's not a secret, as you tell me. So what's going on?
I would say I have not come to terms with why, when people hear that children in our care are not just wanting, but dying, why that hasn't created a movement in government, in opposition, in community to say this is not acceptable. What I do know and what I believe is that our government today is worshiping at the altar of the deficit and worrying about that more than worrying about our children right now. And I feel that that's not acceptable. Of course, we have to take care of how we spend our money, but first we have to decide what we expect to spend our money on. And there is nothing more valuable in this province than our children. And they need to be center stage. They need to be our primary concern, them and their families. And from there we can say, how do we find a way to support them the way we know we must in order for them to thrive?
Let me jump in a second here. The first move the government made was firing you, basically, or closing your office. That was the first move on child welfare. But you continue to advocate for children. You're here in Ottawa today to talk about it. Why is that?
Well, I am not going to stop. I mean, I'm joining the ranks of all the, what I would say, informal advocates that exist in this province. I'm going to walk alongside them. I'm fortunate today to be here with Adopt for Life, the National Adoption Council of Canada, researcher from Western, who are all arguing that children in families that are constituted by the state, whether it's adoptive families or customary care families in Indigenous communities, kinship care families, they all have the right to the same love and support and time to attach to those families as any other Canadian child. If a woman has a child, she is entitled to 16 weeks of time to recover from having that birth, and then 36 weeks of time to attach to that child. Well, children who are in adoptive families or kinship care homes or customary care homes deserve the same amount of time to attach. And I think that's a way that governments can legislate the conditions in which love can flourish. There's nothing more important that governments can do. And I'm going to be here walking with allies and walking with children until I can't, or until they don't want me to. And as long as I'm invited and I have the opportunity, I'm going to be doing that. It's something we can do right now. Right now. We can do that. And it will cost a little bit of money. Not much, but it will make a difference in the lives of families and kids. And, you know, sometimes I think the little things can add up to one day being really big things. And for children, that's important. So you know what? Doug Ford and his government can go around and talk about listening and do the plans they've already had in mind always and cut. I think it's going to be $900 million out of social services budget in Ontario. Go ahead. That's winter. We're in winter now. Spring will come in this province at some point, and we're going to do what we can do to make the lives of children and families better.
Thanks again for talking to us.
Thank you, and thank you for the work you've been doing, and keep on it.
Absolutely. Back to you, Todd.
That's another show in the books, but if you missed any part of it or an earlier one, check out our podcasts. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Todd Lamoran. Thanks for watching.